The coach lurched, and Serafina's teeth clicked together. Outside the grimy window, the world was a blur of hostile green and bruised purple sky. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, the vibration a miserable hum against her bones. She was no longer Lady Serafina Fitzwilliam. That person had died 2 weeks ago in a dusty London solicitor's office where the final, ruinous figures of her family's debt had been laid bare. The woman in this rattling carriage was Sarah Smith, a fiction woven from desperation and a single tenuous thread of connection to a man she had never met. Her hands, resting in her lap, were a testament to her new reality. The skin was chapped from harsh soap and the frantic packing of a single small trunk. The nails were short, one of them broken. She had deliberately scrubbed them until they were raw, hoping to erase the last vestiges of a life of leisure. Yet beneath the deliberate damage, the shape of them remained stubbornly elegant. It was a detail she feared would betray her. Blackwood Manor rose from the landscape like a fortress of dark stone, its many windows glinting like suspicious eyes. It was a place of immense power and wealth, the seat of the Duke of Alistair Beaumont. Her fabricated story was that her mother had been a companion to the Duke's late mother a lifetime ago. It was a lie so thin she felt a breeze could tear it to shreds. But it was all she had. Behind her lay the certainty of a forced marriage to a man whose touch she imagined would feel like spiders crawling on her skin. Ahead lay only this desperate, improbable gamble. The carriage rattled to a stop on the gravel drive. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the cawing of rooks in the ancient oaks that stood sentinel around the house. For a moment she could not move, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner. This was it, the performance of her life was about to begin. Taking a breath that felt thin and insufficient, she pushed the carriage door open and stepped out into the Duke's world. A butler, tall and severe as a church steeple, was already descending the stone steps. He did not look at the shabby coach or her worn travelling cloak. He looked directly at her, and his gaze was unnervingly perceptive. She felt pinned by it, like a moth to a board. "Miss Smith, I presume," he said, his voice a low, smooth rumble. "I am Finch. His Grace is not expecting you." It was not a question, but a statement of fact that laid her deception bare in the first 10 seconds. I wrote a letter," she stammered, the words feeling clumsy in her mouth. She clutched the handle of her small trunk, her knuckles white. "Indeed," Finch replied, his expression unreadable. Letters, however, do not always herald an arrival on the same day. He took the trunk from her grasp with an ease that made her feel foolish for having struggled with it. His fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second, and she had the strangest sensation that he had learned everything he needed to know from that fleeting contact. He led her inside, into a great hall so vast and silent it felt like a cathedral to shadows. She stood awkwardly in the centre of the black and white marble floor, feeling small and utterly fraudulent. Her worn boots seemed to profane the polished stone. Finch disappeared through a tall mahogany door, leaving her alone with the stern, painted faces of long-dead Beaumonts. The silence in the hall was as heavy as wet wool, pressing in on her. She waited, her entire future hanging in the balance of the next few moments. The door opened again, but it was not Finch who emerged. It was the Duke himself. Alistair Beaumont was taller than she had imagined from society whispers, with dark hair that fell over his brow in a way that seemed at odds with his severe reputation. He was not handsome in the classical sense, his features were too sharp, his jaw too resolute. But he commanded the space he occupied with an unnerving stillness. His eyes, a deep and startling shade of brown, assessed her from head to toe. "Miss Smith," he said. His voice was colder than his butler's, a clipped aristocratic baritone that held no welcome. "You have placed me in an awkward position," she curtsied, her body remembering the gesture even if her new station forbade it. "Your Grace, forgive my intrusion, my circumstances are pressing." "So your letter implied," he said, his gaze lingering for a moment on her chapped hands. He made a small, almost imperceptible motion with his own hand, his thumb rubbing over the heavy signet ring on his finger. It was a gesture of contained agitation. "My mother's affairs were always in impeccable order. I find no record of a Miss or a Mistress Smith in her correspondence or her diaries." Her blood ran cold. It was over before it had even begun. "It was a long time ago," she whispered, her throat tight. "Before her marriage to your father." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his eyes narrowed in thought. She could see the calculations turning behind them, the weighing of her story against the inconvenience of her presence. She braced herself for dismissal, for the cold walk back down the long drive. "My mother was known for her kindness," he said finally, the words sounding as if they were dragged from him. "It is the only reason you are not being sent away this instant." He turned his head slightly. Finch, the butler, reappeared as if summoned by the thought alone. "Show Miss Smith to the Rose Room." "She will stay, for now." The Duke's gaze met hers one last time, and it was devoid of warmth or pity. It was the look of a man accepting a distasteful but necessary duty. "We will discuss what is to be done with you tomorrow." He turned without another word and disappeared back into his study, the heavy door clicking shut with an air of finality. Serafina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was in. She had passed the first, most dangerous hurdle. As Finch led her up the grand staircase, she felt a dizzying mix of relief and terror. She was a ghost in this house, a lie walking through its hallowed halls, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. That it was only a matter of time before she was exposed. The cook, a woman whose arms were permanently dusted with flour, knew by the first morning. Mrs. Davies had taken one look at the new arrival's hands when she'd timidly entered the kitchens, seeking a glass of water. The girl held the glass with a delicacy that no amount of rough living could erase. Her fingers were long and slender, and while the skin was red and work roughened, the underlying structure spoke of generations that had never lifted anything heavier than a silver teaspoon. Mrs. Davies had seen enough fallen gentry in her day to recognise the signs. She said nothing, simply handing over the water with a nod that was a fraction more respectful than necessary. Finch, the butler, knew by noon. He had observed her at the solitary breakfast table in the morning room. It was not what she ate, a meagre portion of toast and tea, but how she ate it. The precise way she held her knife, the unconscious grace with which she lifted her cup, the straightness of her spine as she sat. These were not the habits of a poor relation scrambling for a position. They were the ingrained, unthinking mannerisms of a lady of quality. When she had thanked him for refilling her tea, her diction was flawless, her tone modulated with an unconscious authority. Finch had served 3 Dukes of Blackwood. He knew nobility when he saw it, and it had nothing to do with a name. Her first full day was a study in quiet terror. She kept to her room, a beautifully appointed chamber with faded rose-patterned wallpaper and a view of a formal garden. It was a room far too fine for a Miss Smith. Every comfort felt like an accusation. She did not know what to do with herself. There were no duties, no instructions. She was simply there. A piece of unclaimed luggage. That evening she was summoned to dine with the Duke. The prospect filled her with a dread so profound her stomach churned. She put on her only other dress, a simple grey wool that was clean but hopelessly plain. When she entered the cavernous dining room, Alistair was already seated at the head of a table long enough to host a state dinner. He stood, a stiff, formal gesture that seemed to surprise even him. "Miss Smith," he acknowledged, gesturing to a seat halfway down the table, a lonely island in a sea of polished mahogany. The meal was a silent, agonizing affair. The footman moved with spectral quiet. The only sounds were the clink of silver on porcelain and the crackle of the fire in the great hearth. The Duke did not speak, his attention fixed on his plate. Seraphina felt his silence as a physical presence, a weight that crushed the air from her lungs. She risked a glance at him. He was rubbing his signet ring again, a constant, nervous rhythm. For a man reputed to be as cold and unmovable as the stone of his house, it was a strangely human gesture. "Is the room not to your liking?" he asked suddenly, his voice startling her. "No, Your Grace. It is lovely." "Too lovely," she answered honestly, then immediately regretted it. His eyes met hers across the vast expanse of table. "My mother decorated it. She was fond of roses." A flicker of something, sadness perhaps, crossed his face before it was gone, replaced by the familiar cool mask. "You will find the household has a certain rhythm. You are expected to do nothing but remain unobtrusive." The words were a clear dismissal, a command to be invisible. "I understand, Your Grace," she murmured, her gaze falling to her plate. She had asked for sanctuary, and he had given her a gilded cage. In the days that followed, Seraphina learned the art of invisibility. She took her meals on a tray in her room, avoiding the tense silence of the dining hall. She explored the house only when she was sure the Duke was occupied in his study or out riding. The servants treated her with a curious blend of formal distance and quiet solicitude. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, ensured her laundry was returned mended and pressed with a care that seemed excessive for a poor relation. A young housemaid would leave a small vase of fresh flowers on her dresser, never acknowledging the gesture. They were watching her, she knew, and their collective, silent knowledge was a constant, unnerving hum beneath the surface of her days. Her one refuge was the library. It was a magnificent two-story room lined with thousands of books, smelling of leather and old paper and beeswax. She was drawn to it like a moth to a flame, even though she knew it was the Duke's domain. One rainy afternoon, believing him to be out, she slipped inside and ran her fingers along the spines of the books, a lifetime of hunger for the written word rising in her. She pulled down a volume of botanical prints, losing herself in the intricate, hand-coloured plates. "An interest in botany, Miss Smith?" His voice, close behind her, made her jump. She spun around, the heavy book clutched to her chest like a shield. The Duke stood there, his riding boots damp, his dark hair glistening with rain. He looked less like a forbidding aristocrat and more like a man caught in a storm. "Your Grace, I apologize. I thought you were out," she said, her heart pounding. He ignored her apology, his eyes on the book. "That was my mother's," he said, his tone softer than she had ever heard it. He stepped closer, and for the first time she did not feel threatened by his proximity. He pointed to a delicate rendering of a wild orchid. She found this one in the South Woods. No one believed they grew this far north. She was very proud of that. His smile was a brief, surprising warmth, like finding a sunlit patch of floor in a cold stone room. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the memory of it lingered. He showed her a hidden cabinet containing his mother's journals, filled with sketches and pressed flowers. For nearly an hour they stood in the quiet library, two strangers connected by the ghost of a woman. He spoke of his mother with a reserved but palpable affection that chipped away at Serafina's image of him as a man made of ice and duty. When he finally left her there, she felt a strange sense of loss. The interaction had unsettled her more than his coldness. His coldness was a wall she could understand, a defence she could navigate. This brief glimpse of the man behind the title was something else entirely. It was dangerous. It made her feel like a fraud in a way his suspicion never had. It made her wish, for the first time, that she was not Sarah Smith at all. The fragile peace of her cloistered existence was shattered by the arrival of a letter. It did not come through the official post, but was delivered by a farm boy from the village, who handed it to a footman with instructions that it was for the new lady. The footman, well schooled by Finch, delivered it to Serafina's room with a discreet knock and a bowed head. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. It was from a dear friend in London, the only person who knew where she had fled. The script was hurried, the words stark. He is still looking. Lord Fenwick has hired men. He is furious, and speaks of you as stolen property. Be careful. Burn this. The paper felt like ice against her skin. Lord Fenwick, the man whose clammy hands and leering smile had haunted her nightmares. The man she had fled. The thought of him, of his relentless pursuit, brought the terror of her situation crashing back down on her. Blackwood Manor, which had begun to feel like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. If he found her here, the scandal would destroy not only her, but the Duke as well. The shame of it would be unbearable. She crumpled the letter and threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed the words. But they were already burned into her memory. That night she did not sleep. Every creak of the old house was the sound of Fenwick's men coming for her. Her hope, a fragile thing, fluttered like a moth against a window pane, bruised and desperate. Her newfound anxiety made her withdrawn and jumpy. She avoided the library, startled at every shadow. The Duke, when their paths crossed in the long corridors, regarded her with a frown. He saw her pallor, the dark circles under her eyes. She knew he was misinterpreting her fear as unhappiness, perhaps even ingratitude. The chasm of misunderstanding between them seemed to widen with every passing day. One afternoon, seeking air, she was walking in the less tended part of the gardens near the estate office when she heard voices from an open window. Two men, visitors by the sound of their city accents, were speaking with the Duke's land agent. A guaranteed return, one man was saying, his voice oozing a false confidence she recognised all too well. The South Sea and American Canal Company is the future. His Grace would be a fool not to invest. We're offering him a principal share. Serafina froze, hiding behind the thick trunk of a yew tree. She knew that name. The South Sea and American Canal Company. It was one of the very schemes that had completed her own father's ruin. He had believed the same promises, invested everything on the word of just such a man, and had lost it all. The company was a phantom, a house of cards built on lies. Panic seized her. Alistair, for all his cold intelligence, was insulated by his immense wealth. He might not see the danger. He was a man of land and tradition, not the sordid, fast-moving world of city speculation. These men were vultures, and they were circling Blackwood. She had to warn him. But how? To speak to him directly would be to reveal a knowledge of finance that a Sarah Smith could not possibly possess. It would shatter her disguise completely. But to do nothing, to stand by, and watch him be swindled by the same vipers who had destroyed her family, was unthinkable. That evening, her mind resolved, she crept down to the library. The room was empty, lit only by the low glow of a single lamp left burning on the Duke's massive desk. Her heart hammered as she approached it. On a clean sheet of foolscap, using her left hand to disguise her script, she wrote a short, anonymous note. Your Grace, a man who offers guaranteed returns on a canal not yet dug is selling you a hole in the ground filled with water. Inquire after the fate of the investors in the London and Provincial Weaving concern. The pattern is the same. A concerned friend, she folded it, her hands shaking, and left it dead centre on his leather blotter. It was a terrible risk. But it was an act of protection, a repayment in some small way for the sanctuary he had given her. It was the first time since her arrival that she felt she was doing something other than simply hiding. She had acted. As she fled back to the safety of her room, she felt a sliver of the woman she used to be return, a woman of agency, not just a victim of circumstance. Alistair found the note an hour later. He read it once, then twice, a deep frown creasing his brow. The handwriting was a clumsy scrawl, clearly disguised. But the message was unnervingly astute. The London and Provincial Weaving concern had collapsed spectacularly 6 months prior, taking several prominent families with it. He had dismissed it as poor management at the time. The note suggested a more sinister, deliberate pattern. He looked around the empty library, a strange feeling prickling his skin. A concerned friend. Who in his house possessed this kind of insight? Finch was loyal, but unschooled in finance. His agent was competent, but gullible. The note was an act of quiet rebellion against his own judgment, and it troubled him deeply. It also intrigued him. For the second time, a mystery had emanated from the quiet corners of his own home, and he had a growing suspicion that both mysteries had the same source. His attention towards Sarah Smith sharpened. He began to observe her not as a nuisance, but as a puzzle. He saw the way she unconsciously straightened a slightly crooked painting in the hall. He noticed her listening to his political discussions with a rapt attention that a simple companion would not possess. And he saw her in the garden, her back to him, her posture radiating a profound and familiar melancholy. The key turned in the lock one afternoon when he entered the library unexpectedly. She was there, as he had suspected she might be, curled in a window seat with a book. It was not one of his. It was a small, slim volume bound in worn blue leather. As he approached, she looked up, startled, and in her haste to stand, the book slipped from her lap and fell to the floor. He bent to retrieve it. The leather was soft with age. It felt personal, cherished. He was about to hand it back to her when it fell open to the flyleaf. The ink was faded, but the elegant looping script was clear. For my darling Seraphina, on her 18th birthday, may your life be as beautiful as the words within. Your loving father. Seraphina, the name struck him like a physical blow. Lady Seraphina Fitzwilliam, the daughter of the disgraced Earl of Montcrest, a celebrated beauty and wit who had vanished from London society a month ago. Just as rumours of her family's utter financial ruin and a forced marriage to the odious Lord Fenwick began to circulate. He had seen her once, 2 years prior, across a crowded ballroom. She had been surrounded by admirers, laughing, her face illuminated by the chandeliers. He had been struck then by her intelligence, a light in her eyes that outshone her beauty. He had never forgotten her. He lifted his gaze from the book to the terrified woman standing before him. the same eyes, the same elegant line of her throat. Stripped of the silks and jewels, worn down by fear and grief, she was still unmistakably her. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Her grace, her diction, her knowledge of a failing investment scheme. Sarah Smith was a ghost. Lady Seraphina was real. He felt a surge of cold fury, the sting of betrayal. He had been played for a fool in his own home. But beneath the anger was something else, something deeper and more unsettling, a profound, aching sorrow for the woman in the ballroom and for the haunted creature she had become. He closed the book and held it out to her. He did not speak her name. Not yet. He simply looked at her, his face a cold, unreadable mask, and asked the question that now hung between them like a sword. "Who are you, Miss Smith?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The question was not an accusation, it was a demand for the truth, stripped of all artifice. Seraphina felt the last of her defences crumble. The worn book of poetry in his hand was her entire history, her identity, exposed on the library floor. There was nowhere left to run. She looked at him, at the cold fury in his eyes, and braced for the inevitable explosion. But before she could speak, to confess or beg or explain, the mask on his face cracked. The anger receded, replaced by a raw, unguarded expression of something else. "Hurt, confusion, I saw you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. 2 years ago, at the Westerfield ball. You were wearing green silk. The detail was so specific, so unexpected, that it stunned her into silence. I asked who you were. Someone told me. Lady Seraphina Fitzwilliam. He was not shouting. He was not casting her out. He was confessing. My whole life, he continued, his gaze drifting to the rain-streaked window, I have been the Duke of Blackwood. A title, a set of responsibilities. People see this house, they see the name, and they do not see the man. But that night I saw a person, a woman with a light in her eyes, and I never forgot. He turned his gaze back to her, and she saw the profound loneliness he kept hidden behind his ducal armour. When you arrived here, so frightened and worn, there was something familiar about you I could not place. It has tormented me. I thought I was losing my mind. He let out a short, bitter laugh. It seems I was merely a fool. He was vulnerable. The cold, powerful Duke was standing before her, stripped bare by a memory and a name in a book. He had not exposed her, he had exposed himself. The power dynamic in the room shifted irrevocably. The ground, which had been crumbling beneath her feet, suddenly felt solid. He had handed her the truth, and with it an unexpected strength. She lifted her chin. The time for cowering was over. Sarah Smith was born of desperation, Your Grace. Lady Seraphina fled to escape a fate worse than death. She did not plead for pity. She stated a fact. With a calm she did not know she possessed, she told him everything. She spoke of her father's ruin, of the predatory Lord Fenwick, of the crushing terror that had driven her to his door with a fabricated story. She spoke not as a supplicant, but as a woman explaining her choices. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. The Duke, Alastair, looked at her, his expression a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. She had laid her life bare. The choice of what to do with it was now his. But she would not wait for his judgment like a prisoner in the dock. She would write her own ending. I did not come here to entrap you or to trade on your pity, she said, her voice clear and steady. I came here to survive. And now that you know the truth, I will relieve you of my presence. The scandal of my being here would be too great. I shall leave in the morning. It was the most terrifying and liberating sentence she had ever spoken. In that moment, she was no longer hiding. She was choosing her own path, even if that path led into poverty and uncertainty. She would not be a dirty secret in his house. She would be herself, somewhere else. She turned to go, her part in this play finished. Serafina, he said her name. Her real name. It was the first time she had heard it in weeks, and in his voice it sounded less like a title and more like a plea. She stopped but did not turn around. The note, he said. The warning about the canal company. It was you. Yes, she whispered. It saved me from a considerable loss. Perhaps even a catastrophic one. He took a step closer. She could feel the warmth of his body behind her. You protected me. You, who had every reason to despise the world that had cast you out, protected me from it. She turned slowly to face him. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by a wondering awe. Do not go, he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. Do not leave. Stay, not as Sarah Smith, not as a poor relation or a secret. Stay as Lady Serafina Fitzwilliam. Stay as yourself. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently cupped her cheek. His touch was not what she had feared from men. It was warm and steady and profoundly respectful. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. Stay, he whispered again, his eyes searching hers, and let me get to know the woman I have not been able to forget for 2 years. In his eyes, she did not see a duke assessing an asset. She saw a man, lonely and guarded, reaching for a connection he had long denied himself. And in that moment, she felt the last of her fear dissolve, replaced by a fragile, burgeoning hope. She leaned into his touch, a silent assent. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion, but of recognition. It was a quiet, solemn promise in the heart of a silent library, a truth finally spoken after a lifetime of secrets. A year later, the light in Blackwood Manor had changed. It was no longer the cold northern light filtering through dusty panes, but a warm glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Laughter, a sound the old house had not heard in a generation, now echoed in the long corridors. Serafina, now the Duchess of Blackwood, stood by the library window, the same window where she had once hidden in fear. Outside, the rose garden, which she and Alistair had worked to restore, was in full riotous bloom. She rested a hand on the gentle swell of her stomach, a secret joy that would not be a secret for much longer. Alistair came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence a familiar, comforting weight. He was a different man. The guarded coldness had melted away, replaced by a quiet contentment that softened the sharp lines of his face. He still fiddled with his signet ring when he was pensive, but more often than not. His hands were linked with hers. Finch is looking insufferably smug today, he murmured into her ear. Serafina laughed. He is always insufferably smug. He believes he orchestrated the entire thing. He did not, Alistair countered, a smile in his voice. Mrs. Davies thinks she did. She told me yesterday that she knew you were a lady the moment you held a water glass, and from then on, it was simply a matter of letting nature take its course. They fell into a comfortable silence, watching a bee bumble amongst the roses. Serafina thought back to her arrival, a terrified ghost in a shabby dress. She had believed she was fooling everyone, that her performance was a masterpiece of deception. But she had been the only one deceived. The cook had known by the first morning, the butler had known by noon, the maids and footmen had known by the first evening. They, who spent their lives observing the subtle truths of character rather than the grand pronouncements of station, had seen her for who she was from the very beginning. They had seen the lady beneath the grime, the courage beneath the fear. They had protected her secret, not because they were fooled by it, but because they respected the reasons for it. It was only the Duke, the master of the house, insulated by title and distracted by duty, who had remained blind. He had been the last to find out. And Seraphina smiled, leaning back against her husband, because it had not been his discovery of her that had saved her. It had been his discovery of himself. Her arrival had forced the lonely Duke to look past the title and see the man, and in doing so, he had finally been able to truly see her too. The servants had known her identity all along, but it was Alistair who had come to know her heart, and in the quiet warmth of the sunlit library that had made all the difference.